Oh, thank you for that. I was just wondering actually if we should mention Anna about looking for interest into fractionated dosing. Do you want to speak briefly on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So yeah, the other sort of busyness that's been happening lately, aside from doing the research, has been I've been engaging a lot with the vaccine advice. What's the immunisation?
Advisory.
IMAC. I don't know which way you say it. I think they say IMAC when in the conversations I've had. So yeah, so we've been having sort of lots of conversations about, you know, how to address the vaccine hesitancy or the risk of vaccination in people with ME. And so those conversations have been ongoing, and we've arrived at a situation at the moment where they are looking for feedback from the ME community to see their best, and their strong point of position is protection. So they want to do anything they can in their from an advisory point of view to make sure as many people as possible are protected. So they are willing to support a potential low dosing regime for vaccination if there was support, you know, if there was interest from the ME community for that. I guess that the real take-home message is that they are absolutely listening and want to do what they can to support people, knowing that you know, there's adverse reactions are happening in people with ME. So the conversation is there, or it has started, and the next bit of feedback is whether there is any support nationally for something like that, or even in the context of the vaccine as well, where we would be able to gather some very informative data pre and post vaccination or through a vaccine journey in the situations where adverse events do occur. So that's what we're that's where we've arrived, is whether or not there's enough interest nationally to pursue that, and that's what they're asking of me to feed back to them.
And so what we've got the survey that is current at the moment, and we've added questions to that about whether people would be interested in a lower dose, a fractionated dosing. So we encourage people to reply and answer that, and if they are interested in possibly taking part in a trial, then to leave their email address, and we will get back to you on that.
I mean, I think that's great, and I've supplied material to IMAC as well. I mean, my great concern at the moment is the dialogue nationally doesn't mention vulnerable people in the not vaccinated, and so the rhetoric is being repeated, you know, among clinicians, among politicians. I heard between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. on Radio New Zealand, the Deputy Prime Minister saying the same thing, that there are very few people who would have not to get vaccinated. Well, you know, if you look at the population who have ME/CFS, those that are seriously affected might be 1 in 4. Those that have a lot of the immune associated things like chemical hypersensitivity and food intolerance and whatever. You know, I'd like to feel that the national dialogue was a bit more supportive of vulnerable people so that they could make sensible choices, you know, and maybe a fractal dose is a good choice for some, maybe not for others. And certainly I've had a number of people now contact me and tell me their rather tragic stories of what they've suffered after getting vaccinated. So that's why I, you know, have a very cautious approach about the whole thing, and really a sensitive approach I think it should be a sensitive approach to a very vulnerable group of people.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And I would add to that the meeting I had yesterday, they were pretty much clear that the discussions underway at Cabinet have not included ME, you know, have not advanced to that point. So I think it's a very timely we're in a position at the moment to feedback. And I guess they sort of implied as much, and with as much data and sort of information as possible, sort of categorizing how many people would be in this position, because like Peter was, he scanned the literature, and it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's the problem. There isn't much data, right? But essentially they were sort of saying, give us information, but they were very, very much still coming from a position of, we want to help this community. We absolutely understand the vulnerability, but it's still very much coming from a position of how can we encourage and support through vaccination. IMAC themselves also wondered, even from a qualitative perspective, whether they could be involved in understanding the needs and concerns from the ME community too. So, and when we discussed that, they were more sort of saying, would there be resourcing at IMAC to support that? Because they brought that up and sort of said it would be very interesting to canvass as far wide as possible to get the views of people with ME on board, if resourcing allowed. But at the same time, from a vaccination perspective, they very much welcomed, some data. Peter even suggested it coming from clinicians. So as in going to every clinician who diagnoses ME/CFS, and so the data coming, instead of, they were almost dubious about surveys, not dubious, but slightly, but I got the feeling that if the data came from clinicians saying, I have X amount of people with ME, and this is their, and then report back responses and all those sorts of things, that would also help too. So they're very open-minded, but they, that they're in a position where they want feedback to be able to help people with ME through this decision. And so that's why they liked the idea of microdosing as well, because, that's sort of saying we want to get people protected. It definitely wasn't coming from a position of, yes, we're likely to give exemptions to everyone with ME. That's definitely not what they would support. It's kind of like, I think the best type of perspective is a tailored or a stratified approach of how to manage the entire ME community. So it was encouraging and good dialogue, but it's certainly in its early stages, and they don't know what the decisions at Cabinet will be, but they pretty much said that ME and the considerations for ME are not on the table at the moment. So I think the urgency should be there to feedback what the general feel is.
And that's part of our advocacy to answer your question, Leanne,
Yes.
is provide those recommendations to IMAC and
Yes.
Ministry of Health.
Absolutely.
And that's why we're, the survey, it helps us get a better picture of
Yes.
what our community is experiencing with vaccines, and also to find out the number of people who are very reluctant to have vaccines, understandably so, based on their day-to-day experience with ME symptoms.
Yep.
So when
I find actually most of the patients I'm seeing actually desperately want the vaccine, because they've read so much about how very severe the illness can be if they get COVID. And so there's generally a trend to want the vaccine.
Yes,
and
most of the people who have answered the survey are already double
through
dosed.
that with using prednisone and antihistamines, which seem to alleviate some of the ill effects of having the vaccine.
Can I make a couple of comments, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Anna, for your conversations with IMAC. It's great to hear that they're open and interested in the fractionated dosing trial. Just a question about that. If they're open to including people that have had the first dose and had a bad reaction to it, and then having fractionated dosing for the second dose.
Well, in short, they're open. Any suggestion to getting vaccinated, they absolutely want to do. And even you bring up a good point there. If you are someone who gets vaccinated and has a very bad adverse reaction for dose 1, that will be on the table, that you will not be made to get your second dose, because dose is giving you some protection. So there's likely to be a layer there where with your physician you'll be allowed to get exempt from at least having another dose anytime.
Yes.
So I think
yes. Or people that have had a moderately, or even people that have had a moderately bad reaction,
yep.
you know, not severe enough to, you know, not want to ever have another one again, but just, you know, whereas a fractionated dose might, for the second one, you know, might happen. So I just think it'd be nice to include that as an option, because perhaps some people have had their first and not gone on to have their second, and it might.
We need to look at that, because younger people, they're finding that their antibody levels are pretty good, so they may only need one jab. This is different things that they're looking at. Of course, at the moment, the mandate is it's 2 jabs for a vaccine certificate or passport. So that's another thing that we're going back to them with. Is that,
and they're definitely those types of things they're completely on board with. So if you've had 1 dose and reacted badly, you're likely to not, you know, be forced into the second one, and or even extending the gap. Like I think it was I even saw an article with Nikki Turner, maybe even this morning, where she sort of said, you know, like extend the gap between your dose, because even though you still, 1 dose is not going to be long sustaining. You will need a second dose to be properly protected. If your first dose wasn't that bad, if you like. Absolutely. If you're getting a really, really serious adverse reaction, and it's happening, then and if you're bedridden after your first dose, then there's absolutely no rationale for you to get a second, just to protect you. So those things are absolutely on the table. I think any kind of policy to do with helping protect those who want it, I think is key. Plus, and as you said, Ros, if you're hearing that people absolutely want to be protected, I think this provides an opportunity to actually get funding to produce that data for the world. So if people are on board and want to be vaccinated, and I think that's an important question to ask too, that it's not just, would you like a fractionated dose? It's even, would you like to be part of a study that tracks you through your vaccine journey, provides the world with immune data? Because, you know, when the world is on fire, when, you know, when there's loads of virus in the UK and the US, there's no sort of, it's harder to conduct these types of vaccine studies, because, you know, the job is to get everyone vaccinated. And we're in that situation a little bit here. But IMAC are listening, and I believe that they would be open to providing data like that. And the Ministry of Health liked that idea as well. So, you know, the proposal could be that anyone who's not yet vaccinated, if we could provide a route where you're being tracked through your vaccination, if you absolutely want the standard dose or a micro dose, and whether that would encourage uptake. But bearing in mind, you know, it's a personal choice whether people do this. But I think ministry funding would likely become available if that was the approach. Is what I was feeling, because we've got so much to learn from any post-viral condition. Anyone in that situation who gets vaccinated, there's such heterogeneity in immune responses, and it would be wonderful to produce data to that effect, especially if people improve. So I think there's great value to be added if there was enough interest from the ME community.
And that's what we need to ascertain. So what the interest is. So please encourage everybody, you know, to make contact with us so we can establish that.
Another way of perhaps finding people, because not everyone will belong to, you know, ME Auckland or ANZME or, you know, one of the other organisations, is to put a message out to GPs. And I note, I work for one of the Auckland DHBs, and I've noticed, you know, with Medins, you know, Medins messages that go out to GPs, you know, about the vaccination program, and you know, there's been messages and things about immune compromised people and people with, you know, cancer and other conditions, but there's never been a message about, you know, how to tailor the vaccine approach or special considerations for people with ME. And I think that would be a really nice, you know, recognition of the particular needs and things to look out for. And as you're saying, Ros, perhaps prednisone, perhaps antihistamines and things, you know, around that time. I think, you know, that would be, you know, because some GPs aren't that familiar with ME and, you know, the particular concerns.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Yes, I don't know, you know, who would be able to.
Yeah, we can. Yeah, that's fine. That's
right
easy
that
to do.
message.
Yep. No problem.
Same on the Ministry of Health website about vaccination, and it's all about, there's a lot of messaging there around just how it's safe for everyone, and a little bit about immune compromised people with the transplants, but there's nothing on there about people with ME.
No, and I think it's mostly because they have been really pushing the vaccination mandate as protection, and it's only really recently where organizations have gone back to them and said, but hey, what about this group, what about that group? And so now they're listening, which is amazing, and through Anna's connections we're actually getting heard. So it's really good. It's very positive that we can go back to them and give them these recommendations based on the lived experience of our community. And that they're listening, and that they're willing to put the money in to invest in looking at adverse reactions or different dosage levels for people with ME.
Yeah, and because I had a meeting with Ministry as well, and it was encouraging to hear. Well, the Ministry basically said from my sort of portfolio of things I went to them with, come back to us with proposals, because they very much are interested in, especially in the immune size, the tracking the immunity. It wasn't from a position of understanding ME. It was, we want to understand what you guys need, and if there's a way that we can facilitate that, let us know, and we'll see if we could fund that. So and normally, because IMAC are like, well, where's the money going to come from? But that's that route. Like, as in, they're very much, it's very much on the table.
Okay, so the ministry are potentially interested in funding a trial. Fantastic.
Yeah, so the conversation, so I had a conversation with various people at IMAC, and then a ministry and IMAC meeting, and then another IMAC meeting yesterday. So I've had various meetings, and the ministry one was, they sort of said, we're not going to fund everything, but or anything you want or whatever, but they're very much in the position that if we put a case to them, and this is what IMAC said to me yesterday, ministry will need to see that there is a demand and necessary uptake for this to happen, because without that, then it's hard to sell. But if we go to them saying that yes, there's demand for this, that there's very likely a route for funding from the ministry. Yes.
And Anna, in terms of a trial, sort of what kind of numbers would you be looking at as being a relevant demand?
That's a good question, because it depends who oversees it. Like, one perspective was aligning with the standard clinical trial, which I don't necessarily think is absolutely needed, like, as in it doesn't have to be aligned with the traditional clinical trial, because, for example, the one that is underway at the moment was 300 people. I don't necessarily think it needs to be of that scale, and I think it's 5 people is probably not going to cut it, but you know what I mean, like, so I think sort of decent numbers, because these
so 30 is, you can start to generalize from 30 onwards, right? So
I would probably say so, and I can help pitch that in the sense that from the types of deep dive analyses that we can do with the tools we have, would sort of put it beyond like just a clinical trial, if you like, because it will be observational and would align with what standard trials do by tracking antibody levels. But I would fiercely be fighting, making sure that we're looking at cellular immunity as well. Because cellular immunity, if you see that, even with low antibodies, it shows that you've got protection. So yes, like if there was 30, I could definitely make a case for that being of relevance, because all of the immunology publications, they're not huge numbers. Like immunology, when they're very detailed, don't need hundreds. It's more when you're looking at the correlates of immune protection, which we don't actually have a decent marker of, but basically when you're looking at serology, it's where it has to align with all the other clinical trials in the world, kind of thing. So I think
there's some questions. Just some questions through the chat. You were talking about someone named Peter that you were dealing with, and there was just a question: who is he and what organisation?
Peter McIntyre is IMAC. So Peter McIntyre and Joan Ingram are the two people at IMAC, plus I've talked to Nikki Turner and others as well. But the two that I'm engaging with directly on this is Peter McIntyre and Joan Ingram.
And would they be considering any other vaccines besides the Pfizer BioNTech one?
Yeah, that's a good point. I didn't have that conversation with them. I think initially maybe Joan sort of said that, but it might have been a different conversation about adverse reactions, as in, you know, all vaccines have the ability to trigger adverse reactions. And in fact, I think from internationally, I think things like AstraZeneca, I think, is more likely to cause an adverse reaction in people with ME versus the Pfizer vaccines. But if that is something that people would consider too, then absolutely. I'm pretty much, if you're suggesting a vaccine, I think they're all over it. You know, like, as you know, anything that can be a suggestion to help protect people against the virus is what they will be considering. So it depends how quickly any other of the vaccines are approved here.
Now, obviously, with you being based in Auckland as well, I mean, obviously we said it depends on who takes control of this trial, whether it's IMAC or you directly. Ideally, we'd want people from Auckland, but we could, depending if it's with IMAC, potentially other places as well, Wellington, somewhere in the south.
I don't think IMAC would be an advisory role. What we would need is more, what we would need to facilitate this is the clinical input. But then, and it would depend whether it was run like a clinical trials through a clinical trial centre, or whether it would be considered observational and more clinical support. We absolutely have to have clinical support in this setting, that you're getting, you know, clinical support if you're going through, you know, if you're getting vaccinated, you know, knowing that you could have adverse reactions. So from a national point of view, I mean, any of these types of clinical, I mean, we run clinical studies through Auckland Clinical Studies all the time, and generally blood samples have to be received within a 4-hour window to be viable, you know, viable for these types of studies. And yeah, we've got all the teams that deal with this type of study. So from a sample reception point of view, so we do lots of clinical trials like that. So from an Auckland perspective, we would just need the next layer up of the clinical support. I think to make it national, it would be to do with whether there's what level of funding support there is, because you'd essentially have to replicate in another entire team in, say, in Wellington to do that. So it's absolutely, like, when gathering information, it will be worthwhile seeing where, you know, where the large proportion of people are, but it needs all those layers. It needs clinical support so that, you know, patients know that they can see their doctor through this and all the rest of it.
So basically, what we're saying there is, regardless of where you live in the country, if you're interested in participating, let us know. Because if we get a large demand in another area, another city, we may be able to set that up, you know.
Yeah, so. Exactly. So I think it's a matter of canvassing as far and wide as possible and going from there. Like, I mean, I can offer the fact that my lab can run it no problem in Auckland, but I can't guarantee that there would be a partner lab anywhere else in the country. So, and yeah, it might be resourcing. Versus if there is higher demand in Wellington, then yes, we would work with who would do it down there.
And what's our approximate time frame for getting interest back from people and a decision being made?
I think we want to move as fast as possible, because just in the context of even a letter, because I think the decisions are getting made, is it next week or the week after at Cabinet exemption? So I think 15th, the narrative, is it next week? Yeah, the narrative around ME in general, I think should be as soon as possible, so that they're armed with that information, because it just didn't feel like, well, no, I was told that what they do know, what they were privy to, doesn't seem like that ME is being considered there. So that side I would sort of as soon as possible, and then everything's as soon as possible, just because of the mandates coming in. So I think, yeah, there's urgency there.
I think this is really important because, you know, the universities are mandating, and so that means, students with ME who choose not to have the vaccine because they're afraid of the risk, won't be able to attend university. I mean, it's, you know, the spin-on effects for the ME community, particularly those that don't want to, you know, I think the trial idea is fantastic, but there will be quite a few people who won't want to even go that far.
Yeah, and we're still advocating for exemptions for people with adverse. So we're in the process of actually putting together recommendations to IMAC and MOH. Basically explaining that there will be a small percentage who won't even be able to tolerate a lower dosing. So, you know, there are a few that will require an exemption. They did initially suggest that they would be open to granting temporary exemptions if a trial could go ahead. But we're going to advocate for permanent ones as well. And so that should be going out to them in the next week, basically. As far as, I think they're making a decision in Cabinet on the 15th. So
it's the 8th, Fiona, the exemptions for employment.
The exemptions 8th, okay.
They're coming out on the 8th,
So basically we need to get interest in from people in the next few days so that we can put something through Anna's contacts.
I have another question just in terms of the adverse reactions. Is there any data that's come out from the CALM reports, you know, that are showing a higher rate of adverse reactions in people with ME? So, I don't know whether anyone's familiar with them.
Yeah, so we haven't accessed the CALM reports basically because, you know, it encompasses everybody. So we're using, we did talk about actually requesting a copy, but we're doing it through our own survey, and there's CCIS are doing a survey as well. And we're going to release some of those results next week. So far it has been a mixture. Some people have just temporarily worsened, sort of had that normal immune response to having a vaccine. And then other people, you know, there's quite a decent percentage who didn't experience any change at all to their ME symptoms. And then we've had a smaller percentage that have worsened into a relapse or worsened even beyond what they've ever experienced in their ME illness to date. So, and again, it's also a mixture of people's functional capacity as well. So even people who have been able to maintain part-time outside work, even some of those have relapsed. So it's not necessarily the people with the most severe symptoms that have experienced the most adverse events. They definitely have had a higher percentage of it, but it's also people who have had a decent level of functional capacity who have just relapsed. So it's hard to really put a conclusion to that. I guess it shows how highly individualized ME is, and so therefore so is the reaction to the vaccine.
Exactly, because and even let's say we can't even act fast enough and have buy-in to do this. Let's say that happens. I think that even in our current context, I could still make a case to track everyone who is vaccinated. And let's track the immunity of all people with ME who've been vaccinated to see if they're protected, because it's another group, it's another layer that we just don't understand yet. So even if in the context of not getting enough interest to run a trial and have that funded, I think even just tracking immunity is going to provide information, because the heterogeneity of it is just so vast that we just don't know. And I think any type of information gathering that we can provide, I think will be encouraged. Because and then the one last layer that is probably not going to come fast enough, but it's just, and I could see it coming through the COVID commentators today, is antigen testing. And, you know, in true sort of nature, we haven't acted fast enough in New Zealand, but what, you know, vaccination passports are what we're doing now, because there's no other way. But vaccination does not say you're not infected. And so what the antigen testing will bring in when that time comes is it also gives the ability for people who aren't vaccinated to show that they're safe. And so that is likely to be part of our future. It just might not be that it's going to be fast enough. So there's huge demand in the commentators today saying we need antigen testing for these purposes, because a vaccine passport does not say you're not going to infect someone. Because obviously, as we know, not everyone can be vaccinated. And so there's vulnerable people that we could be infecting if we're vaccinated. So again, I don't think there's much we can do about that because of the speed. You know, we don't know when that's going to happen, but that is part of our future for in this space. For those who aren't vaccinated, will be showing that you're not infectious.
I mean, the other contextual layer, which is 2 papers came in to me this week about the waning efficacy of the vaccine. Clearly does seem, you know, 6 months seems to be the time, and Israeli study now showing people that have had a booster versus those who've just had 2 doses after 6 weeks, a huge difference in hospitalizations and whatever. And then also a study from the European Journal of Immunology, which showed that highly vaccinated, over 68 countries, and I think about 2,000 something counties in the US, those places that were highly vaccinated are having more infections than places that are less highly vaccinated. And it's probably just because people are kind of feeling safe and getting out and doing lots of things or whatever, coupled with waning efficacy. So that's another layer which is going to come on top of this. And, you know, the fact that we're rather slow in New Zealand to react, is we're going to be caught up in that as well.
And that waning immunity is something, as I said, as the bare minimum that I think that we should push for is to track ME vaccination and ME, and it doesn't need to be before and after, just from right now, you know, like, as in get as many people to track their immunity, because we need to understand who wanes quickly. It might be that you don't, you know, like, I think that data is going to be informative across the board. So, because absolutely, like, what we're going to see here in New Zealand is, you know, all our healthcare workers are the ones who are vulnerable, because they were, or healthcare and frontline, anyone who was vaccinated early on, are vulnerable, because we've already, you know, they've already passed 6 months of having been vaccinated, while the general population will be at their peak immunity. So we will see this happening. Absolutely, and so we need to be prepared for that. But I think, I think at a bare minimum, if we can propose to ministry or through IMAC that we track, you know, and we can do that, whatever numbers, you know, that would just be a funding perspective of how many we do. But I think a bare minimum is to track immunity in those who are clinically diagnosed with ME CFS and get the vaccine, so we can track the rates of waning and whether that mirrors the general population, higher, lower, and the rest of it. I think it will be highly valuable data to collect.
Definitely. I'm just conscious of the time, and obviously people with ME getting quite tired, so it's 3:20. Are there any other questions at all? Just making sure I haven't missed any from the chat as well. Yeah, so I'll release more of the data of the survey next week. So there was just a question.
Just briefly on one of those questions, like the only thing I would be hesitant about another vaccine, like with Novavax, is that when you look at Pfizer, we've got millions and millions of people vaccinated with it, and that's when it sort of unearths, you know, the rarer adverse reactions, versus Novavax won't have that scale. So we won't know the baseline of, you know, whether there's more or less adverse reactions. So that's the only sort of extra part to other vaccinations.
Ooh. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming along today, and thank you very much to our guest speakers, of course, Dr. Ros Vallings and Dr. Sarah Dalziel, and thank you, Warren, for participating in our Q&A, and Dr. Anna as well. So thank you everybody for taking the time to be here with us today. Appreciate it very much. Cool.